The day he saved a life. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden hue over the sleepy town of Heartwood. A warm breeze fluttered through the oak trees lining the shores of the town's lake, where families gathered for the annual picnic. The air was alive with the sound of laughter, the occasional squeal of children playing, and the sizzling of meat cooking on barbecue grills. It was a perfect summer day, the kind that invited relaxation and camaraderie. For most of the people in Heartwood, it was simply a day of tradition, a moment to connect with neighbors and enjoy the beauty of their small town. David Porter, however, found himself standing at the edge of the crowd, observing from a distance. His long, weathered face, tanned by years of outdoor work, was partly hidden beneath the brim of a faded baseball cap. His hands, calloused from his time in the military and his years working as a mechanic, were buried deep in the pockets of his worn-out denim jacket. The cool breeze lifted his jacket slightly, but it did little to ease the weight of solitude that settled on his shoulders. David had always been someone who preferred the quiet, the solitude of the sidelines. After his time in the army, where he had witnessed both the horrors and camaraderie of war, he found himself drawn to small moments of peace. But peace, it seemed, was something he could only find in quiet observation. He wasn't a man who easily connected with others, not after everything he had seen. And so, while the community picnic was meant to bring everyone together, David remained on the fringe, content to be a silent observer of the happiness around him. He leaned against the trunk of a massive oak tree, its leaves rustling softly in the wind. From his vantage point, he could see the families lounging on checkered picnic blankets, children running through the grass, and the elderly couples enjoying each other's company. But for all the joy he witnessed, a certain sense of detachment clung to him. He didn't mind it. It had become a part of him over the years. But today, as he watched his neighbors laugh and enjoy their day, he couldn't help but feel like he was looking in from the outside. David's years of military training had ingrained in him a sense of vigilance that never wavered. Even in the calmest of moments, he couldn't help but scan his surroundings, aware of every detail. It was a habit he couldn't shake, one that had kept him alive in dangerous situations more times than he could count. His eyes moved over the crowd, taking in the familiar faces of his neighbors, the children playing by the water's edge, the small groups gathered around the picnic tables. He was attuned to the ebb and flow of the scene, like a sentinel on watch. It was then that he noticed the boy. A small figure, not more than 4 years old, wandered away from the gathering, oblivious to the danger that lay ahead. The child wore a bright red t-shirt that stood out like a beacon against the greenery of the lake's shoreline. David's eyes followed the boy as he made his way toward the water. At first, David thought the child must have been with someone, a parent or sibling perhaps, but when he looked around, he realized the boy was alone. His gaze fixed on the child, an uneasy feeling stirring in his chest. The boy, Tyler, was crouched at the water's edge, his small hands dipping into the clear, cool lake water. His eyes were wide with wonder as he splashed the water playfully, unaware of the danger just a few feet away. The bank near the water had eroded over the past few months, leaving a jagged drop where the earth had crumbled away. The current, normally gentle, had grown stronger with the recent rainfall, its current now pulling at the edge of the lake. David's instincts flared. Something was wrong. He knew that kind of inattention well, had seen it countless times in his military days, when soldiers got too comfortable or too distracted. That momentary lapse in judgment could cost a life, and the boy was too close to the edge. David's heart quickened as he saw Tyler inch closer to the water, his feet dangerously near the drop-off. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down, the chatter of the crowd fading into the background. All that mattered was the boy. Before David could even consider what to do, the inevitable happened. Tyler lost his balance, his small body tipping forward as the ground beneath him crumbled away. His tiny hands flailed helplessly, grasping for anything to steady himself. David didn't even think. He simply reacted. His legs moved before his brain even had time to process the action. With a powerful push, David launched himself off the tree, sprinting toward the water's edge. His boots thudded heavily against the earth as he surged forward, his mind focused only on the child. There was no time to waste. The lake's surface rippled as Tyler, now fully off balance, tumbled into the water with a shriek. The boy's desperate cry for help pierced the air as his small body splashed into the water, his arms and legs thrashing in a panic. David's heart pounded in his chest, his training kicking in as he reached the water's edge. Without a moment's hesitation, he dove into the lake. The cold water hit him like a shock, but he didn't flinch. His eyes quickly found Tyler, whose head was barely above the surface, his arms waving wildly as the current tugged him deeper. David's strong arms reached out, grabbing the boy just as he was about to be pulled under. Tyler's wide, frightened eyes locked onto David's, but David's calm presence seemed to reassure him. "It's okay," David murmured, pulling Tyler closer, his voice low and steady. "I've got you." The boy gasped for air, his body trembling with fear. David's grip tightened, and he began pulling them both toward the shore. The water was colder than he expected, the current strong, but David fought against it with every ounce of strength. He had no intention of letting go. Not now. Not ever. With each pull, the shore drew closer. Tyler's frantic movements began to slow as David's steady hand kept him safe. The boy's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, but David remained calm, focused on the task at hand. His legs burned with exertion, his body aching from the strain of swimming against the current, but he pushed forward, determined to get them both to safety. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the shore. David's boots sank into the muddy ground as he staggered to his feet, cradling Tyler in his arms. He could feel the boy's small, trembling body against his chest, could hear the rapid beat of his heart. But the boy was breathing again, and that was all that mattered. David set him down gently on the soft grass, looking him over quickly. The boy's lips were blue, but he was alive. His chest rose and fell as he gasped for air, the terror in his eyes slowly fading as he regained control of his breathing. Hey, it's okay," David said softly, kneeling beside him. "You're safe now." Within moments, Tyler's parents arrived, their faces ashen with fear. The mother's arms shot out as she gathered her son to her chest, sobbing with relief. Tyler, still shivering, nestled into her embrace, but his wide eyes never left David. He seemed to understand, even at that young age, that the man who had just pulled him from the water had done something extraordinary. David stood up, feeling a strange sense of calm despite the rush of adrenaline still coursing through him. He had done his job, and now it was time to fade into the background. That was always how he had been. He didn't need thanks. The boy was safe. That was all that mattered. But Tyler's parents didn't let him slip away unnoticed. They came to him, their faces filled with gratitude, their words tumbling out in a rush of emotion. David simply nodded, offering a quiet smile, before he turned and walked back into the crowd, his heart still racing, but his mind already returning to its usual state of quiet reflection. He didn't need their thanks. He hadn't done it for praise. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. And that was enough. A debt unpaid. The weeks that followed the picnic were a blur of normalcy, with the town of Heartwood returning to its quiet, everyday rhythm. The summer sun grew warmer as the days drifted into the slow pace of August. People went about their routines, the familiar hum of life settling over the town like a comforting blanket. For David, it was a welcome return to his solitude, the events of that fateful day fading into the background of his mind. He had gone back to his life, working long hours in his mechanic shop, fixing cars, taking occasional walks by the lake, and always keeping to himself. The rescue of young Tyler, while a memory that stayed with him, didn't change much for David. That was just who he was, a man who stepped in when needed, without fanfare, without seeking recognition. It was second nature to him, a reflex honed over years of service in the military, where survival often hinged on selflessness and swift action. He didn't expect anything in return for saving Tyler's life. The boy was safe. That was all that mattered. But Tyler's parents hadn't forgotten. A week after the picnic, a bouquet of wildflowers appeared on David's doorstep, tied with a simple note. "Thank you for saving our boy. We'll never forget." It was a kind gesture, though David found it unnecessary. He didn't need flowers, and he certainly didn't need thanks. But as he stood there, staring at the colorful blooms, something stirred in him. Perhaps it was the sincerity in the note or the reminder that, despite his desire to remain a solitary figure, there were people out there who truly appreciated the small acts of kindness. The next few weeks brought more of the same. Occasional greetings from neighbors, a quiet acknowledgement at the corner store, but nothing that disrupted the peaceful existence he had carved for himself. David continued with his work, taking care of his little house on the outskirts of town, keeping to himself, just as he always had. Life, it seemed, had returned to normal. That is, until one warm September evening, when everything changed. David was just locking up his shop, the sun hanging low in the sky and casting long shadows across the street. He had just finished fixing a stubborn engine that had given him more trouble than he cared to admit. His hands were smeared with grease, his shoulders sore from the day's work. As he gathered his tools, preparing to head home for a simple meal and a quiet evening, he heard the sound of a truck pulling into the gravel lot outside his shop. He didn't look up at first, assuming it was another customer in need of his services. But then, as the truck engine cut off and the sound of footsteps approached, he caught the familiar scent of fresh-cut grass and the unmistakable hum of a voice he hadn't heard in weeks. David. David's heart skipped a beat, his head turning instinctively to see who was standing in the doorway. It was Tyler's father, Jason, a man in his late 30s, with a kind but rugged face that looked like it had seen its fair share of hard days. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and his hair was a bit tousled from the breeze, but his posture was still strong, his presence undeniable. Jason had been the one to approach David at the picnic, his gratitude overflowing as he tried to offer thanks for saving his son. David had nodded, offered a brief smile, and then retreated. He hadn't expected this visit. "Jason," David said with a cautious nod, wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't expect to see you around here. What can I do for you?" Jason's expression was a mixture of hesitation and resolve. He stepped inside the shop, his boots making soft thuds on the worn wooden floor. He looked around for a moment, as if taking in the modest, cluttered space, a mechanic's haven, full of tools, spare parts, and the smell of motor oil. It was a far cry from the well-kept homes in the town center, but to David, it was home. It was his world, the only place where he truly felt at ease. I've been meaning to talk to you," Jason began, his voice steady, but edged with urgency. "About Tyler. And, well, about what happened that day." David raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, giving Jason the space to continue. Jason exhaled deeply, his gaze dropping to the floor as if searching for the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did for us," Jason said. "And I don't mean to make a big deal out of it, but, well, we can't just let it go. You saved my boy's life, David. I've been wrestling with how to properly thank you." David chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "You don't owe me anything," he replied gruffly, shaking his head. "I did what anyone would do." Jason's expression grew more intense, his eyes locking with David's. "No, David, not anyone would have done that. Not like you did. You didn't hesitate. You just jumped right in. You didn't think about yourself or the risk. You saved him, my son, and we can't just forget about that." David looked away, uncomfortable with the attention. He shrugged, leaning back against a workbench. "It's done, Jason. You don't have to keep bringing it up. Tyler's fine. That's what matters." Jason didn't seem to be listening. He stepped closer, his hand resting on the counter in front of David. "I know. But the thing is, That day changed everything for me. For us. For Tyler. He talks about you, you know. He's always asking about you. He's 5 now, and he doesn't understand why someone would risk their life to save him. I don't know how to explain that. How do you explain a thing like that to a kid? David's throat tightened at the mention of Tyler. He hadn't thought about the boy much in the days since the picnic, but the memory of the child's terrified face, clinging to life in his arms, was fresh in his mind. The boy's wide, trusting eyes. The warmth of his small body as David pulled him from the water. "Tyler's a good kid," David muttered, unsure of what to say. Jason nodded, his gaze growing distant for a moment as if lost in thought. "He is. And we owe you. We owe you so much. So, I've been thinking. Tyler and I. We've been thinking. Maybe we could help you out. In some way. Maybe it's time we paid you back." David stiffened at the suggestion. The very idea of someone owing him something was foreign to him. He had never asked for anything in return, had never expected anything from anyone. But here was Jason, offering something David didn't know how to accept. "I don't need anything, Jason," David said, his voice firm. "I did what I did because it was the right thing to do. That's it." Jason held his gaze, undeterred. "I understand that. But Tyler insists. He's been asking for weeks how he can help you. I think it would mean a lot to him. And to us. We're grateful, David. You saved our family." The weight of Jason's words settled over David, pressing down on him in a way he hadn't expected. He shifted uncomfortably, the sense of obligation gnawing at him. The last thing he wanted was to be a burden, to accept anything that might tie him to others. But in Jason's eyes, he saw the same sincerity that had been there when the man had thanked him after the rescue. This wasn't about pity, it was about gratitude. David swallowed hard. I don't know what to say." Jason smiled, a warmth in his eyes that softened the edges of his earlier intensity. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that we're here for you, whenever you need us." David nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Maybe it was hope, or maybe, just maybe, it was the realization that, despite his best efforts to keep to himself, life had a way of pulling you back in. And with that, David knew that things were about to change. The offer. The cool breeze of early autumn swept across the small town of Heartwood, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. David stood on his porch, his gaze drifting over the familiar landscape. The quiet streets, the lake shimmering under the late afternoon sun, the trees slowly beginning to change from green to gold. He had always found peace in these moments of solitude. And yet, lately, the stillness felt different. There was an unease in his chest, an unfamiliar weight that had settled over him since Jason's visit. For the first time in years, David had found himself at the center of someone else's life, a place he had never intended to be. He had never wanted anything from the world around him. His military career had taught him to depend only on himself, to keep others at arm's length. He was self-sufficient, a man who could handle whatever life threw his way without asking for help or attention. But now, with Jason's offer still lingering in his mind, David felt that long-standing resolve beginning to crack. "I don't need help," he muttered to himself, his hands tightening on the railing as if trying to steady himself against the wave of discomfort. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. There was a part of him that was tired of the solitude, tired of keeping his emotions locked away. It had been so long since he had let anyone in, and now, for the first time, someone was offering a bridge to connect. Jason had been persistent. After that first visit, he and Tyler's mother, Sarah, had continued to reach out, sending messages, inviting David over for dinner, or simply dropping by to check in. It wasn't pushy, not at all, but it was constant. And it wasn't just Jason anymore. Tyler was starting to ask about him, too. Curious eyes that watched David whenever he crossed paths with the family at the grocery store or the local cafe. The boy's innocent desire to repay him tugged at David's heartstrings in a way he hadn't expected. David had always been the protector, the one who saved others. But now, the very people he had saved wanted to return the favor. The thought was foreign to him, almost uncomfortable. How could they ever repay him for something he had done without a second thought? And yet Tyler's face, filled with a mix of gratitude and confusion, lingered in his mind. The child had witnessed an act of heroism, but he also saw something deeper, a need to understand why David had done it. It was as if, in saving him, David had left an unspoken question in Tyler's heart. Why? The more David thought about it, the harder it became to ignore. The family's offers of help weren't going away, and in some strange way, they had become a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. As much as he resisted, part of him was beginning to wonder if it wasn't just about the debt they wanted to repay. It was about connection, about finding something in his life that had been missing for so long. And as he stood there on his porch, staring out at the world, David realized he couldn't keep pushing them away forever. The decision weighed heavily on his mind for days, gnawing at him like a distant storm. He had spent so much time hiding behind his walls, keeping everyone at arm's length. The military had taught him that showing vulnerability was a weakness, that keeping to oneself was the only way to stay strong. But now, with Jason's constant visits and Tyler's quiet persistence, those walls were slowly crumbling. And so, one chilly evening in October, David made the choice. He didn't have a grand plan or a well-thought-out reason. He simply decided that it was time to stop running from the human connection that had been offered to him. He grabbed his jacket and drove over to the Porter house. The house itself was nothing special. Modest, with a neat lawn and a porch that looked like it had seen its fair share of summer evenings spent with family. The familiar hum of children's laughter drifted through the open windows, and for the first time, David felt a pang of longing. He had always found solace in his quiet home, but in this moment, he couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to be surrounded by the warmth of family, to feel that sense of belonging that he had long since abandoned. Jason greeted him at the door with a smile that was equal parts warmth and relief. "David, good to see you, man. Come on in." David stepped inside, the smell of home-cooked food filling the air. It was the kind of comforting aroma that reminded him of simpler times, of the family dinners he had once taken for granted. Sarah was in the kitchen, her laughter spilling out as she and Tyler worked together to set the table. The sight of the boy, so full of life and energy, brought a faint smile to David's lips. "Hey, David," Tyler called out from the kitchen, his voice filled with that youthful exuberance. "Are you going to stay for dinner? I made cookies." David couldn't help but chuckle at the boy's enthusiasm. "I'm sure they're going to be delicious, Tyler," he replied, ruffling the boy's hair as he walked further into the house. Jason led him to the living room, where they settled into the worn but comfortable couch. The atmosphere was relaxed, familiar, a far cry from the tense silence that usually filled David's own home. Sarah soon joined them, her smile just as warm as her husband's. "So," Jason began, settling in beside him, "we're glad you came, David. We've been thinking, maybe we could really help you. You don't have to say yes right away, but maybe you could come with us on a weekend trip. Just a few days, get away from the shop, relax. You've been working too hard." David's initial response was to decline. His instinct screamed at him to say no, to retreat into his shell, and avoid becoming tangled in anyone's life. But as he looked at Tyler, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a drawing pad in his hands, and then at Jason and Sarah, their faces open and full of kindness, something in him softened. They weren't asking for anything in return. They just wanted to give back, to show gratitude. And despite his hesitation, David couldn't deny that the idea of a change of pace, even for a few days, sounded almost nice. I'm not used to this," David admitted, his voice low. "I don't know how to accept help." Jason nodded understandingly. "You don't have to have it all figured out. Just take it one step at a time. We're not asking for anything. We just want to spend time with you, help you relax, take a break." David paused, the idea swirling in his mind. A trip. Time away from the constant hum of his work, away from the isolation he had embraced for so long. It wasn't a permanent solution, but maybe it was a start. Maybe, for the first time in years, it was time to let himself breathe. "All right," he finally said, the word feeling strange on his tongue. "I'll go." Jason's face lit up with gratitude, and even Sarah seemed to exhale a sigh of relief. But it was Tyler who truly beamed, his joy uncontainable. "Yes," the boy exclaimed, jumping up from the floor. "We're going to have so much fun, David." David couldn't help but laugh. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Something he hadn't realized he needed until now. The weekend away. The weekend arrived faster than David had anticipated. His work had kept him busy up until the last possible moment, and he found himself packing his things with a sense of trepidation. It wasn't that he didn't want to go. In fact, he had been looking forward to the time away from the shop, the peace of nature, and the company of a family that seemed to genuinely care about him. But the thought of leaving behind the life he had built, his routine, his independence, still made him uneasy. It was a strange feeling, to step into someone else's world, especially when that world was so different from the solitary life he was used to. But Tyler's excited face kept flashing in his mind. The boy who, without understanding, had somehow transformed David's life. And Sarah and Jason's kindness, which had persisted despite David's reluctance, seemed to have broken through the walls he had spent years building around himself. Maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe it was time to let people in, if only for a few days. The trip was to a small cabin up in the mountains, just a few hours away from Heartwood. It was the kind of place David had never thought to visit, a cabin nestled in a valley surrounded by towering trees and craggy cliffs. He had spent his entire life near the lake, the familiar landscape of the town comforting in its predictability. The mountains, with their towering peaks and wild beauty, seemed like a distant world to him. When David arrived at the cabin, the sky was already painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, a refreshing change from the summer heat that still lingered back home. He could hear the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant call of birds settling in for the evening. The peacefulness of the place immediately struck him, a stark contrast to the noise and commotion of his usual life. The porters had arrived earlier in the day, and Tyler was already running around the yard, his laughter echoing through the trees. Sarah was inside, unpacking, while Jason was setting up a small fire pit in the backyard, ready for a night under the stars. It was clear they had made this a special trip for David, and he could feel the weight of their expectations. They wanted him to relax. They'd wanted him to enjoy himself, but David didn't know how to do that. How do you just let go? As he unpacked his bag and set his things in the small room they had prepared for him, David couldn't help but feel a sense of intrusion. This wasn't his life. He wasn't used to being the guest. He wasn't used to people going out of their way for him. And yet, here they were, doing just that. Despite the warmth of their welcome, he felt out of place, like a soldier dropped into an unfamiliar environment with no clear mission. "David." Tyler's voice broke through his thoughts, and David turned to see the boy standing in the doorway, eyes wide with excitement. "We're going to have a bonfire. You're coming, right?" David smiled, though the gesture felt stiff. "Sure, Tyler. I'll be right there." The bonfire was everything David had imagined it would be. A crackling blaze, the warmth of the fire spreading through the cool night air, and the scent of wood burning mingling with the smell of grilled food. The porters had brought marshmallows, hot dogs, and even a cooler full of soda. Tyler was practically bouncing with excitement, eager to roast marshmallows and share stories around the fire. As the evening wore on, David found himself sitting beside Jason and Sarah, their laughter filling the night as they exchanged stories from their past. Tyler had snuggled up next to David, his small form leaning against him as they watched the flames flicker and dance. For a brief moment, David allowed himself to relax, the tension in his shoulders easing as the warmth of the fire seeped into his bones. But even in this peaceful setting, David's mind was never fully at rest. The unfamiliarity of it all kept pulling him back to his solitary world. He couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, how it felt like a place he would never truly belong. He watched Jason, who was clearly enjoying himself, and Sarah, who had a smile on her face that seemed to radiate warmth. It was obvious that this family, this unit, was something special, something David had never truly experienced. "David," Sarah said, her voice cutting through his reverie, "I'm really glad you decided to come. It's nice to have you here." David looked over at her, surprised by the sincerity in her eyes. "Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me," he said, though his voice was gruff, as if trying to mask the emotion stirring within him. Jason chimed in, his voice light, but filled with meaning. "You've got nothing to prove to us, David. You're here because we want you to be here. No need to put up walls." David's heart clenched at the words. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him like that, with such open honesty. He wasn't used to being seen, to being cared for. It was always easier to retreat into the shadows, to let his actions speak louder than his words. But here, with the Porters, he didn't have to be the strong, silent man anymore. He could just be. "I don't know if I'm the kind of person who belongs in a place like this," David admitted quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I've never really known how to let people in." Sarah's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's okay, David. You don't have to have it all figured out. Just take it one step at a time. You've already done so much for us. It's okay to let us do something for you." David's chest tightened at her words, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. The idea of being taken care of being part of something, of feeling like he was worth something more than just the man who saved a little boy, was overwhelming. But it also felt good. It felt right. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't sure if it was gratitude or something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. But for the first time in a long while, David felt the stirrings of something hopeful, a small flame of possibility that maybe, just maybe, this family could be the bridge to something he had lost long ago. Connection. As the night wore on, the fire burned low, and the stars above them twinkled in the clear sky. Tyler had fallen asleep in David's lap, exhausted from the excitement of the day. Sarah and Jason sat back, enjoying the serenity of the moment. And for the first time, David didn't feel the urge to pull away. He simply allowed himself to be part of the moment, of their world. Maybe this was what he needed after all, a debt paid in ways unseen. The days at the cabin passed in a blur of laughter, quiet moments by the fire, and activities that were foreign to David in the best possible way. Fishing by the stream, hiking through the winding trails that cut through the forest, and sitting around the table for meals that were more about the shared experience than the food itself. David began to find solace in these simple moments. Tyler, in particular, had taken to him in ways that David hadn't expected. The boy would follow him around like a shadow, asking questions, seeking his company at every turn. He wasn't demanding, just curious. An open book with a childlike sincerity that made David's heart tighten. It was clear that Tyler's perception of him wasn't just about the rescue from years ago. The boy looked up to him, not as a hero, but as a figure of stability, a person who had shown him that there was goodness in the world, something worth aspiring to. Jason and Sarah, too, had become like anchors in David's world. Jason's jokes, always lighthearted but deeply caring, kept the mood relaxed, while Sarah's quiet but wise advice gave him moments of pause. There was a depth to her kindness that David had rarely encountered. It wasn't an effort to fix him, but a gentle encouragement to help him rediscover parts of himself he had long buried. One afternoon, while they were hiking through the woods, David found himself walking beside Sarah. Tyler had run ahead, chasing a squirrel, and Jason was a few paces behind, scanning the trees for birds. The air was crisp, and the sound of crunching leaves beneath their boots filled the silence between them. Sarah glanced at him, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You've been quiet, David," she said, her voice gentle, as if she already knew the weight on his mind. "I know this is all new to you, but I can see how much you're starting to enjoy it. We're glad you came with us." David shifted his gaze to the path ahead, his mind trying to make sense of the feelings that had been bubbling up inside him. It's not what I'm used to," he confessed, the words leaving him before he could stop them. "But I've been thinking. Maybe I've spent too much of my life thinking I'm better off alone." Sarah's steps slowed as she reached out to gently touch his arm. "You're not alone, David. You never have to be." He looked at her then, her eyes warm with understanding, and for the first time in a long time, David felt like maybe she was right. The walls he had built around himself were starting to feel heavy, cumbersome, like a suit of armor that didn't quite fit anymore. He had always thought that being alone was a badge of honor, a mark of his resilience. But now, in the presence of this family, he was beginning to question whether resilience meant shutting everyone out. They reached the summit of the hill and paused to take in the view. The lake in the distance stretched out like a silver mirror beneath the setting sun, and the forest around them stood tall and undisturbed. The peace of the moment settled over David, and for once he allowed himself to simply be. "That's what you've been running from, isn't it?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone soft but perceptive. "The idea that you can belong somewhere, that you don't always have to fight to survive." David didn't answer immediately, unsure of how to articulate what he was feeling. "I thought I had to be strong on my own," he said at last, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't think anyone else could understand, and I didn't want to be a burden to anyone." Sarah's eyes softened with sympathy, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're never a burden, David, and you don't have to do this alone. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is accept help, even if it feels uncomfortable." He nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so long building walls around himself, never allowing anyone to get too close, convinced that it was the only way to protect himself. But maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Maybe strength wasn't in isolation. Maybe it was in allowing others to be there for you, to help you carry the load. That evening, back at the cabin, the family sat around the table together, sharing stories and food. Tyler was animated, recounting his day's adventures with an energy that was contagious, while Jason chimed in with his own humorous take on the events. For a moment, David simply watched them, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was what he had been missing, this feeling of connection, of warmth, of knowing that he wasn't alone in the world. They had accepted him without question, without expectation, and they hadn't made him feel like he had to be anyone other than himself. The fire crackled outside, casting flickering shadows across the room as they finished their meal. Jason leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know, David," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "Tyler's been asking a lot about you." David raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "He keeps talking about how he wants to be like you," Jason continued, a smile tugging at his lips. "He looks up to you, David, more than you know." David's chest tightened at the thought. "I never thought about it like that," he muttered, looking down at his hands. "Tyler's a special kid," Sarah added. "He sees more than most people realize, and he's grateful to you, more than you'll ever know." David felt a lump form in his throat. He had saved Tyler's life all those years ago, and now here was the boy, no, the young man, offering him a kind of grace he hadn't expected. Tyler's quiet admiration was a reminder that David's actions had meant more than he had ever realized. He had given something invaluable, hope, and now, in return, Tyler wanted to show his gratitude in his own way. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, David stood outside, gazing up at the stars. The quiet of the night, the cool breeze on his face, and the gentle rustling of the trees all seemed to echo the stillness inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, a sense that maybe he had found something worth holding on to. In that moment, David realized that this weekend, this brief escape from his old life, had changed him. It wasn't just the beauty of the mountains or the quiet moments of reflection. It was the connection he had found with the Porters. It was the way Tyler's admiration had stirred something deep inside him. A reminder that his past actions had rippled out into the world, leaving a legacy that he hadn't even known about. He had saved Tyler's life, yes, but in doing so, he had unknowingly planted a seed of gratitude, a debt that had been paid in ways unseen. David didn't need grand gestures or elaborate repayments. He simply needed to open his heart, to accept that, sometimes, the greatest gift you can give is allowing others to care for you. And as the fire burned low and the world settled into quiet slumber, David felt a sense of hope rise within him, one that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The ultimate test. The final day at the cabin arrived faster than David had expected. The once unfamiliar quiet of the mountains had now become a place of solace for him, a place where he had begun to shed some of the weight he had carried for so many years. Tyler had stayed close to him the entire weekend, his energy boundless, as if he were trying to make up for all the years he hadn't been able to thank David properly. Sarah and Jason had woven themselves seamlessly into David's life, offering him glimpses of a world where trust wasn't a currency but a gift, freely given and freely received. The morning was crisp as the family gathered their belongings, ready to head back to Heartwood. David helped load the car, his movements slow and reflective. He had come to appreciate the serenity of this place, the way it had quietly worked its way into his heart, making him feel less like an outsider and more like someone who had a stake in something larger than himself. Jason approached him as he was securing the last of the bags in the trunk. "You okay?" he asked, his voice sincere. David looked up, meeting Jason's eyes. The question was simple, yet it felt weighty, like a challenge he didn't quite know how to answer. "Yeah," David replied slowly. "I've been thinking about a lot of things." "You've been quiet," Jason said, leaning against the car, his tone casual but probing. "It's been a good weekend, hasn't it?" David nodded, though he didn't immediately reply. His thoughts were still churning, filled with the strange mix of gratitude and discomfort that had settled over him like a blanket he wasn't used to. The weekend had been eye-opening. It had shown him parts of himself he had long since buried. His capacity for connection, his ability to be vulnerable. But now, as the time to leave neared, a part of him wanted to cling to the sense of peace the cabin had offered, to stay nestled in this temporary cocoon where he could pretend that the world outside didn't exist. But that wasn't realistic. Life didn't wait. The world kept spinning, whether you were ready for it or not. The question was, how would he face it? How would he handle going back to a place where his routine and isolation had kept him safe, but had also kept him locked away from everything he truly needed? "You know," Jason continued, his voice thoughtful, "we don't expect you to be perfect, David. We don't expect you to have all the answers. But what you do for people, what you've done for us, well, it matters. And it's not about repaying some debt. It's about knowing that you're part of something bigger than yourself. You don't have to shoulder everything alone." David's eyes flickered with emotion, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel the truth of Jason's words. His military background had ingrained in him the need to stand alone, to rely on no one but himself. But here, in this place with these people, he was beginning to understand that the greatest strength wasn't in isolation. It was in being part of something. A family, a community, a bond that extended beyond what could be measured by duty alone. "Thanks, Jason," David said quietly, his voice rough with unspoken emotions. "I didn't know what I needed until I was here. But I think I get it now." Jason clapped him on the back with a grin. That's what we're here for, man. Now let's get back to reality. I'm sure Tyler will want to see you at the lake when we get back. He's already talking about all the plans he has for you." David chuckled at that, the familiar pull of warmth in his chest. Tyler had been insistent about showing David all of the things he had planned for their time together once they returned to Heartwood. It was clear that the boy had taken the idea of repaying David seriously, not in grand gestures, but in the small, everyday acts of love and care. As the family drove back toward the town, the landscape changed before David's eyes. The towering mountains gradually gave way to rolling hills, and the dense trees thinned out to reveal open fields and winding country roads. With every passing mile, David felt a mixture of reluctance and anticipation. He had enjoyed his time away, but he also knew that he couldn't remain in the safety of this bubble forever. The reality of his life, the life he had built in Heartwood, was waiting for him. The quiet existence he had carved out for himself, hidden behind the walls he had spent years constructing, was still there. It was as if the cabin had offered him a glimpse into what life could be like if he allowed himself to truly live, to let others in, and to accept that not everything had to be a battle. But he wasn't sure if he was ready to let go of the control he had fought so hard to maintain. Back in Heartwood, the first thing that hit David was the noise, the familiar hum of the town, the bustling streets, the sounds of cars and people, and the rhythms of daily life. As the porters pulled up to his house, David felt an unfamiliar sense of anxiety. His heart beat faster, the weight of reality settling on his shoulders once again. Tyler was the first to jump out of the car, racing toward David. The boy's face lit up with excitement as he stopped in front of him, breathless with anticipation. "David," Tyler exclaimed, pulling something from his pocket. "I made this for you while we were gone. It's for you to remember the weekend." David looked down at the small, crudely wrapped package in Tyler's hands, and something inside him shifted. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a grand gift at all. But the thought behind it, the fact that Tyler had spent his time thinking of him, planning how to show his gratitude, struck David with an emotional force he wasn't prepared for. Opening the package, David found a small wooden carving, a simple figure of a man standing tall, hands outstretched, as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. It wasn't intricate or detailed, but it carried with it a raw, honest simplicity that made David's throat tighten. "This is you," Tyler said proudly. "You're always helping people, always doing stuff for others. I wanted to make sure you knew you're a hero to me." David looked at the carving, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. He didn't need the accolades. He didn't need the recognition. But this small act of kindness, this moment of pure gratitude, was everything. It was everything he had been missing, everything he had never allowed himself to receive. I don't know what to say," David managed, his voice thick with emotion. Tyler simply smiled up at him, his young face full of sincerity. "You don't have to say anything, David. I just wanted you to know. I wanted to show you that I'll always remember." And in that moment, David realized that sometimes it wasn't about big gestures or grand deeds. It was about the quiet moments of connection, the acts of love that passed between people without fanfare. He had saved Tyler once, but Tyler had saved him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. It was as if the boy's gratitude had opened a door to a world David had forgotten existed, a world where love and care flowed freely, without expectation or repayment. As David stood there, holding the small carving in his hands, he understood something profound. He wasn't alone, and for the first time, he didn't want to be. He had a family now, one that had been waiting for him to accept it all along.